The BFG by Roald Dahl. And you may hear some interesting music and such in the background because I'm actually having a good time. And I wish to share my good time with you. The Witching Hour. Oh yeah, Chattanooga, Tennessee in the house. The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. No, not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour. Somebody had once whispered it to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep, deep sleep. And the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow, and she decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you had to go to the lavatory, it was not accepted just as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now, and Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on her chest beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, and then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now, and the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale, and everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic, and it didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall, very black, and very thin. Chapter. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times the size of a standard human. It was so tall, its head was higher than an upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. And on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, and then it would move on, and then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop in and peer into the upstairs windows of each house on the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it actually was. It would stop and peer in. It would slide on to the next house and stop again, peer in, and so on along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly, looking at it carefully. She had decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that's what it was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand it was holding what looked like a very long and thin trumpet. In the other hand it held a large suitcase. A large suitcase. What do you do with a large suitcase? What do you do with a large suitcase now? Yes. I'm just trying to get this whole scene thing right. You know, undisclosed locations have a tendency to be a little confusing, and perhaps, there we go. Yes, that's it. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Guccis had a greengrocer shop in the middle of the high street. The high street being the main street, because we're talking about English contexts here, and when you say main street in America, that's often the high street, and when you're talking in English vernacular. And the family lived above the shop. The two Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room, and Sophie knew that. The giant was peering in through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. Across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. Canning jar, perhaps. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping, and she saw the giant take a deep breath in, and whew, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet and into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at her. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a "Help!" and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse, tingling all over. Nothing like midsummer, right, kids? Midsummer. Oh, and by the way, I am available for both parties and undisclosed locations to do readings from. So if you've got any ideas about that, please do let me know. Because that is how that works. Right? Good. Chapter. The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After about a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There was, at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person, staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the windows and this was followed by an arm, and an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, and the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. Gulfport sounds amazing. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clapped down over her blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. Whoosh! A snatch. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. Yes, you're right, that's really scary. Being snatched out of your own bed, in an orphanage no less, by a ginormous hand in the middle of the night. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on. Although she couldn't see it happening, she knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had gotten Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all the four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through the little gap just below the giant's hand. So when you pick up a handkerchief by its four corners, of course they're going to have those little loopy things inside of there. And if you're a small human, then you can just ding, and so the blanket actually is considered, if you're a giant, a blanket would then be considered a handkerchief because of scale, right? Yes. She saw the village's houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path, and he crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, because he is hungry and he wants to go home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. We'll just have to see about that. Chapter: The Cave. The giant ran on, but now a curious change took place in the way of his running. He seemed to suddenly go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was traveling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung at Sophie's cheeks, and it made her eyes water. It whipped her head back as whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind was rushing past Sophie's face, became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word when used to describe a galloping giant. He leapt over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, and then down into a valley and up over the range of hills as bare as concrete, and soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great, craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying in amongst the delicate frosty white flakes of clouds, and over to one side of the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing. "No coconuts tonight, but thank you." It was my technology. Right behind the mountain, the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving. In and out, he paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive, round stone. As big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football, and now where the stone had been there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large that the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand and the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped, turned, and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away, and Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He's getting ready to eat me. He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." The blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high, rocky roof. Aperol's so tasty. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves stood row upon row of glass jars. There were glass jars everywhere. They were piled in the corners. They filled every nook and every cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat, and didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Chapter. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he's really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," he grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man gobbling and cannibal? You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and there goes gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere round. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear burst, and noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles round." "Ouch," said Sophie. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey. Every night bone crunchers galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks? What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumptious. Bone-cruncher says Turkish human beings are a glamoury flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of Turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumptious and some is ookie slush. Greeks is all full of ookie slush. No giant is eaten Greeks ever." "Why not?" "Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," said the giant. "I imagine that's possible too." And she was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite for talking about food. "As I'm saying, all human beings have a different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong hats." "Why hats?" "You is not very clever. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle." "Do you like vegetables?" asked Sophie, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable." "Oh, but the bean is a vegetable." "Not the human being. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all." Sophie didn't argue any more. The last thing she wanted to do was to make a giant cross. Cross being the English word for angry. "The human being is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very hooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales." "You mean Wales?" said Sophie. "Wales is different from, quite different from Wales." "Wales is Wales. Don't gobble funk around with the words. I now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue. Humans from Jersey is tasting of cardigans." And if you don't know all the references of jerseys and all that stuff coming from the British Isles, do a bit of homework. "You mean jerseys?" Sophie said. "You're once again gobble-funking. Don't do it. This is serious and a snitching subject. May I continue?" Oh, please do. Danes from Denmark. Ever so much at dogs. Of course, they taste of Great Danes. Wrong! Said the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they're tasting our Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Danes! Great Danes! Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie asked. I is a very mixed up giant, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for ice supper. Wellington? Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, said the giant. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumptious taste, so welly-eating giant. So says him. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Boots. Of course, I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough, and she was going to be eaten. She'd rather get it over with and done with right away and than be kept hanging on around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others, gobbling up every night. Nom, 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 nom. But me? I's a freaky giant. A freaky one. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she had just heard. This is phenomenal. And the cocktail ain't too bad either. Chapter. The Giants. But if you're so nice and friendly, then why did you snatch me away from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taking a witch hipswitch. Why? Well, first of all, said the BFG, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do. But that's only because you have seen me. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing that you would be doing, you would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you are actually seeing a giant, and then a great giant and a mighty giant look-see would be starting up all over the world. With the human beings all rummaging for the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be a-coming rushing and bushing after me. Goodness knows what they would be catching me and locking me in a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me in the zoo or the Buckingham House with all those squiggling hiddle-o-gumpins and the crocodillies. Sophie knew that what the giant said was true. If any person reported actually having seen a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo and across the world. I will bet you that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world. Wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away? I suppose I would. And that would never do. So, what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you do go back, then you will be telling the world, most likely on the telly, bunkum box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh, no! Oh, yes. But I am warning you not to ever go a-whiffling about this cave without eyes with you, or you'll be coming down to the uckity-muckety end. I is a-showing you now who is going to eat you up if there's ever catching you one tiny little glimpse of you. The big, friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, girl, and tell me something what you're seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was now up and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with its blue rocks and dead trees. "Is you seeing 'em?" Sophie, squinting through this glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 of the others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country. Those are all giants, everyone." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt. Man, there's these phrases, right? There's certain phrases that show up inside of literature, and this is one of them. A sort of short skirt. Damn. I should make that into a tongue to... Yeah, one of those. Where burnt brown by the sun was their skin. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain the most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant, upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were! Many of them had large bellies. Many of them, all of them had long arms and very big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly, and perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing. They is just a-mooching and a-fooching around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will be all a-galloping off to places where people is living and find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" "Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course. But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of flung-away places like Wellington for the booty flavour and Panama for the hearty taste. Every giant is having his own favourite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crod scallop." "I'm not quite sure I know quite what that means." "Meaning's not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I left instead of right." "And are all those beastly giants over there really going off tonight to eat people? That explains the back of the milk cartons. Beep, 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 beep. All them is guzzling human beings every night," said the BFG. "All them excepting me. That is why you'll be coming on an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you. You would be swallowing up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop." "But eating people is horrible. It's frightful. Why doesn't someone stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle. All those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my widiness and double my royal highness." Highness? Twice as high as you? "Easily that. You is seeing them at a distance, but just you wait till you get them up close. Those giants is at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles and cockles alive, and this is, I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is puddle nuts in giant country." "You mustn't feel bad about it," Sophie said. I think you are just great. Why, even your toes must be big as sausages." "Bigger. They look as big as bumpelhammers." Someone want to look up bumpelhammer for me? How many giants are out there? 9 altogether. That means that somewhere in the world, every single night, 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive. More? It is all depending on, you see, how big the human being is. Japanese beings is very small. So a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before they's feeling fulled up. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those make a good tuck-in. But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world? All countries except in Greece is getting visited some time or another by the BFG. The country which the giants visits depends on how he's feeling. If it's very warm weather, and the giant's feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he would probably go galloping far up to the Frisbee north to get himself an Esquimau or 2, or to cool him down. A nice fat Esquimau to a giant is a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it. And then again, if it is a frosty night, then the giant is frigid with the cold. He'll probably point his nose towards the sweltering hot lands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm him up. If you don't know the Hottentots, you should look him up. How perfectly horrible! Nothing hots up a cold giant like a hot Hottentot. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them now, would they really eat me up? Like a whiff's widow! And what's more, you is so small that they wouldn't even have to chew you. The first one seeing you would pick you up in his fingers and down you like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside. I hate even watching them. Chapter. Apparently we have a definition. Thank you, Gary. Thank you. Chapter. Marvelous Ears. Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table. Is you quite snugly in your nightie? He asked. Is you frigidly cold? I'm fine, thank you. I cannot help thinking about your poor mother and father. By now they must be jipping and scumping all over the house, shouting, Hallo, hallo, where's Sophie gone? I don't have a mother and father. They both died when I was a baby. Ah, you poor little scrumpiet. Is you not missing them very badly? Not really, because I never knew them. You's making me sad. Don't be. No one's going to be worrying too much about me. The place you took me from was the village orphanage, and we're all orphans in there. You's an orphan? Yes. How many is there in there? 10 of us, all little girls. Was you happy there? I hated it. The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Clunkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, like getting out of bed at night or not folding up your clothes, you got punished. How is you getting punished? She'd lock us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink. That rotten old rotter scrapper! It was horrid. We used to dread it. There were rats down there, and you could hear them creeping about. That filthy old fizzwiggler! That's horrible riddest thing I've ever heard for years. You's making me sadder than ever. All at once a huge tear that would have filled a bucket rolled down one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. What a strange and moody creature this is, she thought. One moment he is telling me my head is full of squashed flies, and the next moment his heart is melting for me because Miss Clonkers locks us in the cellar. The thing that worries me Sophie said, is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I? All is my fault. I is the one who kid-snatched ya. Yet another enormous tear welled from his eye and splashed onto the floor. Now that I come to think of it, I won't actually be here all that long, Sophie said. I's afraid you will. No, I won't. Those brutes out there are bound to catch me sooner or later and have me for tea. I is never letting that happen. For a few moments the cave was silent. May I ask you a question? The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand and gave Sophie a long and thoughtful stare. Shoot away. Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? You were poking that long trumpet thing into the Gucci children's bedroom and then blowing through it. Now he's getting nosier than the Parker. And the suitcase you were carrying, what on earth was that all about? The BFG stared suspiciously at the small girl sitting cross-legged on the table. You's asking me to tell you whoopsie secrets? Secrets that nobody's ever hearing before. I won't tell a soul. I swear it. How could I anyway? I'm stuck here for the rest of my life. You could be telling the other giants. No, I couldn't. Or you told me they would eat me up the moment they saw me. And so they would. You was a human being, and human beings is like straw bunkers and cream to the giants. If they're going to eat me the moment they see me, then I wouldn't have time to tell them anything, would I? You wouldn't? Then why did you say I might? 'Cause I's a brimful of buzzing burgers. If you listen to everything I'm saying to you, you'll be getting earache. Please, tell me, what were you doing in our village? I promise. You can trust me. Would you teach me how to make an elephant? What do you mean? I would dearly love to have an elephant to ride on. I would so much love to have a jumbly big elephant and go riding through the green forest, picking up peachy fruits off the trees and all day long. This is a sizzling hot, mucky frumping country we live in. Nothing grows in except snuzz cucumbers. I would love to go somewhere else and pick peachy fruits in the early morning from the back of an elephant. Sophie was quite moved by this curious statement. Perhaps one day I will get you an elephant, and the peachy fruits as well. Now, tell me, what were you doing in the village? If you're really wanting to know what I'm doing in your village, I's a blowing dream into the bedroom of the children. Blowing a dream? What do you mean? I is a dream blowing giant. When all the other giants is off a galloping every way, this way and that, which swooping to human beings, I is a scudding away to other places to blow dreams into the bedrooms of the sleeping children. Nice dreams, lovely golden dreams. Dreams that is given the dreamers a happy time. Now, hang on a minute. Where do you get these dreams? I collect them. I has a billions of them. You can't collect a dream, Sophie said. A dream isn't something of which you can catch a hold of. You is never going to understand about it. That is why I is not wishing to tell you. Oh, please, please tell me. I will understand. Go on. Tell me how you're to collect dreams. Tell me everything. The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs. Dreams is a very mysterious things. They's floating around in the air like a wispy, misty bubbles, and all the time they is a searching for sleeping people. Can you see them? Never at first. Then how do you catch them if you can't see them? Aha! Now he is getting into the dark and dusty secrets. I won't tell a soul. I is a trust in you." He closed his eyes and sat quite still for a moment, while Sophie waited. A dream, as it goes a-whiffling through the night air, is making tiny little buzzing, humming noise, but this little buzzy humming so silvery soft it is impossible for a human being to be hearing it. Can you hear it? The BFG pointed up to his big, enormous truck wheel ears, which now began to move in and out. He performed this exercise proudly, with a little proud smile on his face. "Is ya seeing these?" "How could I miss them?" "Then maybe it be looking a little preposterous to ya. But you must believe in me when I say this is a very extra usual ears indeed, and they is not to be coughed at." "I'm quite sure they're not." "They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddly little thing." "You mean you can hear things I can't hear?" "You is deaf as a dumpling compared to me. You is a-hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours, but I'm a-hearing all the secret whisperings of the world." "Such as what?" "In your country, I is a-hearing the footsteps of a lady bird as she goes walking across the leaf." "Honestly?" "What's more, I is a-hearing those footsteps very loud. When a lady bird is walking across the leaf, I is hearing her feet going clumpety, clumpety, clump like a giant's footsteps." "Good gracious me! What else can you hear?" "I is hearing the little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle round in the soil." "You mean you can hear ants talking?" "Every single word, although I is not exactly understanding their language." "Go on." "Sometimes on a very clear night, and if I is a-swiggling my ears in the right direction," and here he swiveled his great ears upwards so they were facing the ceiling, "if I is a-swiggling them this way and that, this night is very clear, and I is sometimes hearing the faraway music coming from the stars in the sky." A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, waiting for more. "My ears is what told me you was a-watching me out of your window last night." "But I didn't make a sound." "I was hearing your heart beating across the road, loud as a drum." "Go on, please." "I can hear plants and trees." "Do they talk?" "They is not exactly talking, but they's making a noises. For instance, if I come along and I is a-picking a lovely flower, if I is a-twisting the stem of the flower till it breaks, the plant is a-screaming. I can hear it screaming and screaming very clear." "Oh, you don't mean it! How awful! It's a-screaming just like you would be screaming if someone was twisting your arm off." "Is that really true?" "You think I was a-swizz-figgling you?" "It's rather hard to believe. Then I is a-stopping right here. I is a-not wishing to be called a fibster." "Oh, no, I'm not calling you anything. I believe you. I really do. Please, please, go on." The BFG gave her a long, hard look and stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. "I believe you." Now, quick little side note. This is one of the coolest things that I absolutely adore about Roald Dahl's work, is that the characters in his book are fearless. They may, well, actually, they may be not fearless. Maybe, everyone needs fear because fear is good for legitimate things. But I believe the appropriate term would be courage. And courage is one of the most powerful things that we can stir inside of ourselves. And I think that courage would be one of those things that we could stir on a daily basis. So stir your courage tomorrow, the next day, and all the days after that. Because courage is what keeps us moving. She had offended him. She could see that. I wouldn't ever be fibbing to ya. I know you wouldn't, but you must understand that it isn't easy to believe such amazing things straight away. I understand that, so please forgive me and do go on. He waited a little while longer, and then he said, It is the same with the trees as it is with flowers. If I is a chopping an axe into the trunk of a big tree, I hear a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? A soft moaning sound. It is like the sound of an old man is making as he's dying slowly. He paused. The cave was very silent. Trees is living and growing just like you and me live. They is alive, so is plants. He was sitting very straight in his chair now, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and as bright as two stars. Such wonderful and terrible sounds I's a hearing. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some is like glorious music, glorious, glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his thoughts. His face was as beautiful in its blaze of emotions. Tell me some more about them. You just ought to be hearing the little mices talking. Little micey's is always a talking to each other, and I's a hearing them as loud as my own voice. What do they say? Only the mices know that. Spiders is all talking a great deal. You might not be thinking, but spiders is the most tremendous matterboxes. And natter, 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 natter. And when they's a spinning their webs, they is a singing all the time. They is a singing sweeter than a nightingale. What else do you hear? One of the biggest chat bags is the caterpillars. What do they say? They is arguing all the time about going to the prettiest butterfly, and that is all they ever talking about. Is there a dream floating around in here now? The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. There's no dream in here, except in the bottles. I has a special place to go for catching dreams. They is not often coming into giant country. How do you catch them? The same way you was catching butterflies. With a net. He stood up, crossed over to the corner of the cave where a pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net on the end of it. Here's the dream catcher, he said, grasping the pole in one hand. Every morning I's a going out and snitching new dreams to put in my bottles. Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. I is a getting hungry. It is time for eats. It is a time for eats.